Our scripture this morning is Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. At the time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, which he put in the midst of them, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child, they are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me." Matthew 18, verses 1 through 5. Now, for us to explore this edict from the master teacher, we have to compare it to the Apostle Paul's later and better known words in 1 Corinthians. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. So what's going on here? Jesus is declaring that he loves the little children, all the children in the world. They're precious in God's sight. And just one generation later, Paul's telling the church of Corinth to grow up. But before we explore the value of spiritual childhood, we must cast away the Paul of Paul's letter, whose words aren't contradicting the master teacher, but address another issue altogether, and that's childish behavior. Now, you see, the new church in Corinth, which we recognize as the first integrated church, that being Jews and Gentiles, it had a lot of infighting. Those who had money held greater positions of responsibility, and the Gentile members, understandably new to the Ten Commandments, were still trying to get a hang of specifically the seventh, that being, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." So Paul, being diplomatic, describes these matters as childish things, but those are not things of children. Yet another reason why we can't read the Bible without historical context. And it's a shame because these words from Paul, "When I became a man, I put away childish things," written over 20 years after the departure of Jesus, have been misguidedly used to quash the very aspects of children Jesus was honoring. Perhaps not literally, but it's something our parents used upon us in one way or the other, something we went on to use against our peers when we got a little older, and sadly, eventually turned upon ourselves. So when the disciples ask Jesus, "Who is the greatest in heaven?" they're concerned about a hierarchy, not unlike the status and power-hungry members of the Corinthian church. But this is why the example of a child, liberated from the concerns of status and power, is so remarkable. About this exalted state of childhood, it's like each of us is starring in our own version of Citizen Kane. We don't grasp how precious true childhood is while we're in it. As adolescents, once we become aware of status, hierarchy, and how we fit in it, and the boundaries of our own power, we can't wait to grow up. Surely adulthood will fix everything. Yet somehow, barely into adulthood, we realize what we've lost. And middle age onward, we work so that someday we can recapture some of the magic of our earliest halcyon years. When I finally saw Citizen Kane, it was in an old movie house, and at the poignant climax, as a dying Charles Foster Kane conjures his lost childhood, a woman in the back row of the theater spontaneously called out, "Oh, Rosebud's the sled." And I so desperately wanted to call back, "Well, duh, but not exactly." True story. So when I was little, I lived in a small military base in Alaska. It was all I knew. But the magic of it wasn't lost on me. Moose wandered onto the playground while we swung. We played hide and go seek in this arboreal forest. The sun having set around 2 p.m., we made forts in the deep snow under starry skies. But even at the age of 4, I could see that the world was being replaced by another one. And that's when I decided that Peter Pan should come for me. And wise for my years, I knew that 4 years was a little too soon for that to happen. 6 years was about right, I reasoned. 6 to 8. And I gave this a lot of thought. I could go as late as 12. He could come for me as late as 12. But 6 to 8, that was the prime window. A couple years later, I was lying in my bed, and a shadow moved across the wall. Now, it's possible someone had driven by with their high beams on, maybe. But after all this time, there it was, this shadow moving across my bedroom wall. And I panicked. "Not now," I whispered. It occurred to me in that very moment what my disappearance would do to my mother. And I couldn't do that to her. And as quickly as it came, the shadow disappeared, never to return. 6 years later, on the eve of my 13th birthday, as I faded off to sleep, I scanned my bedroom walls one last time and accepted he's not coming. But I woke up the next morning a newly minted teenager with something intact and has remained with me all these years, a healthy Peter Pan complex. But I mean this not in the pop psychology sense, because I had no problems growing up. I had no issues with responsibility. But I never stopped believing in the magic of those early years. I never lost the wonder and curiosity of it all. And I continue to believe, even if metaphorically, I could fly. Now, while we may have to tread carefully through the material world with these kinds of traits, spiritually, I believe this is exactly the kind of child that Jesus was talking about. Look at the scriptures. The disciples, in their decidedly unchildlike way, are thinking empirically. We think of growing up as something vertical, something linear. It's exactly this empirical take on growth which gives us the false notion that growth is upward and onward and implies leaving things behind. The Rabbi Bernard Raskus, in his book Jewish Spirituality, shares a Yiddish folk tale about two men engaged in earnest debate. How does one grow? From the feet up or the head down? From the feet up, of course, said the first. "Last year I bought my son a suit, and the pants were just right. Now they barely cover his knees. That proves people grow from the feet up." "Fool," snapped the second. "If you see soldiers marching, all their feet are on the same level, but their heads are a different height. That proves people grow from the head down." Now, the Rabbi Raskus reasons in his writing that we grow, of course, from the inside out. The Torah, he writes, fosters this continuous and creative process. Education and study broaden the mind. Concern for the welfare of others develops character. Knowledge brings new insights, new maturity. In learning about others, we learn about ourselves. Intellectually, spiritually, we never stop growing. So if we stop growing, there must be aspects of us still in that child state. And that's the wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing to celebrate about ourselves. Just as the child asks, "Why is the sky blue?" we have a lifetime of things to be curious about, to be in wonder of. I get a big grin when I hear people justify rightful adult decisions with, "Life is too short to put up with that." Because to my mind, life is too long to put up with that. Too long to set up house in those conditions, whatever person, place, or thing that may have been. I say this not to deny that our physical lives are as long as they are intended to be. Now, I say life is long as a reminder that there's a lot of new still out there. And if one has no control over the chronological length of one's life, one certainly has considerable say in its breadth and its depth, either of which could look like length, depending on the angle, maybe standing on your head. So as physical children, the age of 20, much less 50 or 60, is far away, but still rife with possibility. As spiritual children, there's still so much to discover to our left, to our right, above us, and beneath us. Yet, what have our so-called grown-up eyes taught us to expect in those directions? The extreme left, the extreme right. That's above my pay grade. That's beneath me. The spiritual child looks in any direction and finds another reason to be curious or marvel, another opportunity to grow and explore. And this is why I love metaphysics. We marvel in the divine. We're in awe of its infinite and ever-revealing complexity. Thus, we do not presume to have a lock on God, because with certainty, we don't just risk superiority. With certainty, we declare the end of growth. And as the master teacher, and later Paul declared, these are the antithesis of what's great in the kingdom of heaven. The certain and superior adult looks in the four directions, places empirical value on what it finds, and reaps a tangible but momentary reward. The most joyous and wonderful traits of our human childhood remain the most powerful tools of our ongoing spiritual childhood. It looks in the four directions, and it sees friendly faces, and it finds something new to marvel at and be curious about. And in turn, it cultivates the kingdom of heaven.